The story opens in a suffocating, ritualistic atmosphere within the pack's dressing chambers. The pacing is slow and agonizing, focusing on the sensory details of Ivara being scrubbed and adorned in ceremonial white silk that feels less like a wedding gown and more like a burial shroud. The tone is heavy with dread. We see the immediate physical struggle as Ivara winces while the handmaidens roughly apply heavy makeup to cover the faint, golden markings on her skin, hiding the very thing that makes her a cursed anomaly. We learn that Ivara has spent her entire life as a shadow in her own pack, an Omega feared for her strange heritage and forced to serve the elite to survive. The narrative quickly escalates the stakes by introducing her pack's alpha, a man desperate to gain political favor. He has decided to offer Ivara as a tribute to the terrifying Alpha King, Kairos Raventhorn, a ruler rumored to be consumed by blood madness. This decision is not an honor but a death sentence. The Alpha is simply feeding the monster to keep him away from the rest of the pack. This creates a sense of immediate, inescapable doom. As the carriage doors lock her inside, Ivara accepts she is being delivered to a beast, establishing the tragic sacrifice state that makes her eventual power awakening so impactful. The heavy oak doors groaned shut behind her, the sound finalizing her fate. The lock clicked, a sharp, metallic finality that echoed in the cavernous room. Ivara stood frozen, her heart hammering against the white silk that felt too tight, too much like the burial shroud she knew it was. The air here was different. It didn't smell of rot or blood, as the stories whispered. It smelled of ozone, heavy rain, and something sharp, like lightning striking pine. The room was dim, suffocatingly humid, lit only by the faint, dying embers of a hearth and the pale moonlight filtering through high, arched windows. A splash cut through the silence. Ivara turned her head toward the sound. In the center of the sunken stone chamber lay a pool of dark water. Ripples broke the surface, and then he rose. King Kairos Raventhorn was nothing like the grotesque beast the rumors painted. He was worse. He was terrifying beauty wrapped in lethal power. Water cascaded off broad, scarred shoulders, tracing the defined ridges of his back as he stood. His hair, long and black as a raven's wing, clung to his neck, dripping onto his bare chest. Every movement was fluid, predatory, and painfully human. He turned, and Ivara forgot how to breathe. His eyes were burning amber, glowing with a bioluminescent intensity that pierced the shadows. They weren't human. They were the eyes of a wolf looking out from a man's face, dilated and wild. "Who let you in?" His voice was a low growl, vibrating through the heavy air and settling deep in her bones. Ivara stepped back, her hands trembling as she clutched the silk of her dress. The guards, Your Majesty. I am the tribute." A snarl ripped from his throat. Kairos moved, and the water around his waist churned violently. He stalked toward the edge of the pool, rising from the water like a vengeful god. He didn't bother with a towel. The droplets slicked his skin, emphasizing the raw, coiled strength of his muscles. "A tribute?" He laughed, but it was a dry, humorless sound. "They send me a lamb to slaughter? Do they think fresh meat will cure the madness?" He stepped onto the stone floor, the water pooling around his bare feet. He was massive, towering over her even from across the room. The air around him crackled, the pressure dropping as if a storm were brewing inside the walls. "Leave," he commanded, his voice straining, the amber glow in his eyes flickering erratically. "Get out before I lose the last shred of control I have." Ivara scrambled backward, her fingers fumbling blindly for the iron handle of the door behind her. She yanked it with both hands, desperation clawing at her throat. It didn't budge. I can't," she whispered, the terror turning icy in her veins. Kairos froze, his fists clenching at his sides until the knuckles turned white. The beast was close to the surface, and they were trapped in the cage together. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the sound of Kairos's ragged breathing. He didn't attack. Instead, he spun away from her, putting the width of the room between them as if distance alone could shackle the monster beneath his skin. Ivara pressed her spine against the cold stone of the wall, sliding down until she was a heap of white silk in the darkest corner. She watched him, her breath caught in her throat. The king was pacing. Back and forth he stalked, a predator wearing a man's shape, his wet feet leaving dark damp prints on the stone floor. Every muscle in his back was coiled tight, twitching with spasmodic energy. He wasn't looking at her anymore. He was fighting an invisible enemy. His hands clawed at his temples, tangling in his damp black hair, and a low, guttural whine escaped his throat, a sound of agony, not aggression. Ivara's terror began to shift, the icy grip on her heart loosening just enough to let curiosity bleed through. She had been told he was a rabid dog, a killer who reveled in bloodshed. But as he paced, stumbling slightly, she didn't see a monster. She saw a man burning alive from the inside out. His skin was flushed with a feverish heat, the veins in his neck distended as he fought to keep the wolf from tearing through his human form. He was in pain. The realization struck her with the force of a physical blow. The blood madness wasn't just a rage, it was a torture. Her gaze drifted to a small table near the hearth, where a silver pitcher sat, beaded with condensation. Her throat was parched, but looking at him, at the way his chest heaved, gasping for air that seemed too thin to sustain him, she knew he was worse. Slowly, carefully, Ivara pushed herself up. Her knees knocked together, threatening to buckle, but she forced them to hold. The rustle of her silk dress sounded like a thunderclap in the quiet room. Kairos froze, his back to her. "Stay back," he rasped, his voice sounding like gravel grinding together. Ivara didn't stop. She moved to the table, her hands trembling so violently the silver pitcher rattled against the goblet as she poured. The cool, clear sound of water splashing into the cup seemed to cut through the tension in the room. She took a step toward him. Then another. Kairos whipped around, his amber eyes blazing, pupils blown wide. He looked ready to strike, his teeth bared in a snarl that would have sent seasoned warriors running. But Ivara stood her ground, holding the goblet out with both hands like an offering to a deity she didn't understand. "Water," she whispered, the word barely audible. "Please, you're burning." For a heartbeat, the beast stared at her, confused by a kindness it hadn't earned. The amber fire in his gaze flickered, the feral edge dulling just a fraction as he looked from the trembling cup to the terrified girl brave enough to offer it. He didn't take the cup. Before his fingers could graze the cold silver, a spasm of agony arched his back, snapping the fragile thread of his control. A roar tore from his throat. A raw, jagged sound that was less human than the thunder outside. With a savage motion, Kairos backhanded the heavy oak table beside him. The wood splintered with a sickening crunch, sending the pitcher flying. It shattered against the stone wall, spraying water like shrapnel. Ivara gasped, dropping the goblet as she scrambled back, shielding her face from the debris. He was a hurricane confined to a bottle, and the glass had just cracked. Kairos turned on a velvet armchair, his claws extending, shredding the fabric as if it were paper. He was destroying everything in his path to keep from destroying her. His breathing was a series of ragged snarls, his amber eyes completely swallowed by the beast, seeing nothing but red haze. "Run," he choked out, the word garbled by lengthening fangs. "Run, you foolish girl." But Ivara couldn't move, her feet felt rooted to the cold stones, not by fear, but by something else. A strange, magnetic pull tugged at the center of her chest, a phantom tether tightening between her and the raging king. It was an instinct she had never felt before, a desperate, screaming need to soothe the storm. Against every survival instinct screaming at her to flee, she stepped forward. The air around him was scorching, thick with the scent of ozone and burning fur. He was vibrating with lethal energy, his back to her, chest heaving as he prepared to strike the stone mantle. Ivara reached out, her hand trembled, but she didn't pull back. Her fingers brushed the fever-hot skin of his bicep. "Kairos," she whispered. The reaction was instantaneous. A jolt of energy, like a static shock amplified 1,000 times, surged through her palm. Beneath the long sleeves of her white silk dress, the skin of her forearm burned, not with pain, but with light. The heavy makeup she wore to hide her shame dissolved under the intensity of the flare. Golden markings, ancient and swirling, ignited along her skin, glowing bright enough to shine through the fabric. Kairos froze mid-strike. The tension in his massive frame snapped, his muscles unlocking all at once. He gasped, a sound of profound, sudden relief, as if a crushing weight had been lifted from his lungs. Slowly, terrifyingly, he turned his head. The feral haze in his eyes had vanished. The amber was clear, sharp, and wide with disbelief. He looked from her glowing arm to her face, his expression one of utter shock. The beast was gone, silenced by a single touch. "What are you?" he breathed, his voice trembling not with rage, but with awe. Ivara stared back, her heart pounding against her ribs, equally terrified by the power pulsing beneath her skin. For the first time in her life, she wasn't hiding in the shadows, she was the light holding back the dark. The silence that descended on the room was absolute, heavier than the stone walls enclosing them. Kairos slid down against the mantelpiece, his legs sprawling out before him, the fight draining from his body like water from a cracked vessel. He looked at his own hands, steady now, no longer claws seeking destruction. "It never stops," he murmured, his voice rough with exhaustion. "The fire. It feels like my blood is boiling inside my veins, cooking me alive from the inside out." Ivara remained standing where she was, clutching her wrist where the golden light had pulsed moments ago. The markings had faded back to their faint, dormant state, hidden beneath the silk, but the tingling sensation remained. "The madness?" she asked softly, daring to bridge the silence. "It isn't madness," Kairos corrected, lifting his gaze to hers. The amber eyes were dim now, weary and agonizingly human. "It is power. Too much of it. My ancestors were blessed by the moon goddess, but the lineage has concentrated the strength with every generation. I was born with a sun trapped in my chest, and this body." He gestured to his scarred, muscular frame. "This body is too weak to contain it. I am not losing my mind, Ivara. I am burning to ash." Ivara's breath hitched. She had always heard he was a monster, a creature of mindless violence. She had never imagined he was a vessel cracking under the weight of its own contents. "But when you touched me," Kairos trailed off, his gaze dropping to her hand. He reached out slowly, telegraphing the movement so he wouldn't startle her, and gently took her fingers in his. His skin was still fever-hot, but hers was cool, a soothing balm against the inferno. "It stopped," he whispered, wonder coloring his tone. For the first time in years, the fire didn't just recede. It vanished. "You didn't just calm the wolf, you anchored the man." He looked up at her then, and Ivara felt her knees go weak. The look on his face wasn't the lust of an alpha, nor the dismissal she was used to from her old pack. It was reverence. He looked at her as if she were water in a desert, as if she were the holy grail he had spent a lifetime searching for. "They told me I was cursed," Ivara admitted, her voice trembling. "My pack. They said the markings were a sign of impurity." "They were fools," Kairos said, his thumb brushing over her knuckles, sending a shiver up her arm. "You are not a curse, little Omega. You are the only thing keeping me from burning the world down." For the first time, Ivara didn't feel like a tribute sent to die. She felt like the lock to a door only she could open. The fear began to ebb, replaced by a fragile, terrifying hope. She wasn't just surviving the monster, she was saving him. The heat in the room had settled into a humid, heavy warmth, no longer stifling but encompassing. Kairos stood and waded back into the center of the sunken pool, the water lapping against his chest, dark as obsidian. He turned to her, the water dripping from his hair creating ripples that moved toward her like silent invitations. "Wash it off," he said softly. It wasn't a command, but a plea. "The paint, the scent of that other pack. Wash it all away." Ivara hesitated at the edge. The white silk dress was heavy, a cage of fabric, and her face felt stiff with the thick layers of paste her former alpha had ordered to conceal her imperfections. But looking at Kairos now, amber eyes clear and waiting, the fear that had ruled her life felt distant. Slowly, she stepped down the stone stairs. The water was gloriously hot, soaking into the silk, turning the fabric translucent as it clung to her legs. She waded in until the water reached her waist, the warmth seeping into her chilled bones. Kairos moved closer, the water parting around his massive frame. He didn't touch her at first. He cupped a handful of water and let it cascade over her shoulder, rinsing away the perfumes of the court. Then, with a hesitation that betrayed his own fear of breaking her, he reached for her face. "May I?" he murmured. Ivara nodded, her breath hitching. His thumbs brushed her cheekbones, wet and rough-skinned but impossibly gentle. He rubbed away the heavy makeup, the gray paste dissolving into the dark water like smoke clearing from the sky. With every stroke, he stripped away the mask she had been forced to wear, revealing the skin she had been taught to hate. As the last of the paint washed away, the golden markings along her collarbone and neck seemed to sigh with relief, glowing softly against the gloom of the chamber. They were not random splotches, but intricate, weaving lines that looked like sunlight trapped in flesh. Kairos froze, his hands hovering just above her shoulders. His gaze traced the glowing script, his expression shifting from reverence to a dawning, terrifying realization. "I thought they were myths," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. He traced the curve of a golden spiral on her neck, sending a jolt of warmth through her that rivaled the water's heat. The sun kissed. The Luna healers. He looked into her eyes, searching for the truth she didn't know she held. In the First Age, it was said the moon goddess gave alphas their strength to protect, but she gave omegas like you the light to heal the damage that strength caused. "You aren't cursed, Ivara. You are royalty of the old blood." Ivara trembled, the water swirling around them. "I was told I was broken." "No," Kairos said firmly, pulling her slightly closer until the heat of his chest radiated against hers. "You are the cure." The peace of the sanctuary shattered with 3 heavy knocks on the oak door. The sound echoed like gunshots in the quiet chamber. Kairos stiffened instantly, the water around him rippling as his muscles coiled. The vulnerability he had shown moments ago vanished, replaced by the iron mask of the king. He stepped out of the pool, grabbing a robe, his face hardening into granite. He cracked the door open just an inch. Low, urgent whispers drifted in from the corridor, the voice of a guard, frantic and breathless. Ivara stayed in the water, feeling the chill creep back into her bones as the warmth of the moment evaporated. When Kairos turned back, his face was pale, his jaw set tight. "Get out," he said, his voice clipped and cold. "Get dressed. A car is waiting at the back gate." Ivara stood, water sluicing off her silk dress. "What is happening?" "The council." Kairos spat the word like poison. "They are here. Tonight. They claim it is a routine check on my sanity, but they brought the executioner's blade. They're waiting for me to slip." He crossed the room, grabbing a dry cloak and throwing it at her. "If I show even a flicker of the madness, they will kill me. And they will not hesitate to slaughter a tribute found in my chambers. You need to be miles away." He was pushing her away again, trying to save her by exile. But Ivara saw his hands trembling beneath the sleeves of his robe. The stress was already triggering the heat in his blood. The amber in his eyes was beginning to bleed into the whites. Without her anchor, he would snap before the council even sat down. He was sending her to safety, but he was sentencing himself to death. "No," she said. The word was soft, but it held the weight of stone. Kairos stopped, staring at her as if she had spoken a foreign language. "Did you not hear me? If you stay, you die." Ivara stepped out of the pool, her wet dress clinging to her skin, her golden markings humming with a faint, stubborn light. "If I leave, you die. You told me I am the anchor. How will you survive the council's provocation if you are burning alive?" She walked up to him, ignoring the warning growl vibrating in his chest. She placed a wet hand over his heart. The contact sizzled, and the tension in his frame eased instantly, the gathering storm in his eyes quieting. "I am not running anymore, Kairos. I am not a victim to be hidden away." Kairos looked down at her, conflict warring in his expression, the desperate need for her touch against the terrified instinct to protect her. He gripped her wrist, not to push her away, but to hold on. "They are wolves, Ivara," he whispered, his voice cracking with fear for her. "They will tear you apart." "Let them try," she answered, her gaze meeting his with a newfound steel. "I am the cure, and I am staying." The great hall felt less like a dining room and more like a gladiatorial arena. Long shadows stretched across the banquet table, cast by flickering iron chandeliers that did little to warm the icy atmosphere. At the head sat Kairos, looking every inch the imperious king, clad in black velvet that hid the tension locking his muscles into stone. Beside him sat Ivara, no longer the trembling tribute, but a silent sentinel draped in deep blue silk. Her hand rested discreetly on his forearm. To the onlookers, it looked like a gesture of possessive affection from a king's favorite. In truth, it was a lifeline. Through the fabric of his sleeve, she pushed waves of cool, golden calm into his bloodstream, countering the rising heat of his agitation. "We heard troubling rumors, Your Majesty," Councilman Vane said, slicing into his steak with surgical precision. He was an older wolf with eyes like flint, watching Kairos for a single twitch. "Reports of structural damage to your private quarters. Uncontrolled outbursts. Renovations, Kairos replied, his voice smooth but tight as a bowstring. The west wing was outdated. Ivara felt the muscle beneath her palm jump. The lie cost him. She stroked her thumb over his wrist, grounding him. He exhaled slowly, the amber in his eyes remaining steady, denying Vayne the reaction he craved. The council members exchanged disappointed glances. They had come to witness a monster, but they were met with a composed monarch. Then, the wine steward approached. He was a beta Ivara hadn't seen before, his movements quick and nervous. He poured a goblet of dark crimson vintage for Kairos. The scent hit Ivara a split second later. Beneath the rich notes of oak and berry, there was something acrid. Bitter, like burning herbs. Wolfsbane. But before she could draw breath to warn him, Kairos, eager to wash away the dry taste of the interrogation, lifted the goblet. He took a long, deep swallow. The effect was instantaneous. Kairos stiffened as if he'd been shot. The goblet slipped from his fingers, shattering against the stone floor, the red wine spreading like fresh blood. His skin turned ashen, then flushed a violent, feverish red. He choked, clutching his throat as the poison reacted with his unstable blood, acting as an accelerant to the madness he had fought so hard to contain. Kairos? Ivara whispered, gripping his arm harder, trying to push her light into him, but the barrier was too thick. He turned to her, and the terror in his face broke her heart. The wolfsbane was tearing his control to shreds. His pupils blew wide, swallowing the amber iris, swallowing the man. A low, vibrating growl started deep in his chest, loud enough to silence the room. He turns. Vayne shouted, triumph gleaming in his eyes as he stood up, drawing a silver blade that had been concealed beneath the table. The beast is loose. Kill him. The sound of Kairos's body tearing itself apart was sickening, a symphony of cracking bone and ripping velvet. He fell to his hands and knees, the heavy banquet table overturning with a crash that sent silver plates and goblets flying. A roar erupted from him, deep and primal, shattering the high windows of the great hall and letting the storm outside rush in to mix with the chaos. He was shifting, but it was wrong. The wolfsbane twisted the transformation, making it jagged and incomplete. Massive, furred ridges burst from his spine, his jaw elongated with a spray of blood, and his amber eyes rolled back, consumed by pure, rabid violence. He was no longer a king, he was a catastrophe. Do it now, Vayne screamed, his voice cutting through the chaos. Cut his head off before he fully turns. He is rabid. A dozen guards surged forward, silver blades gleaming in the candlelight, aimed at the exposed neck of the writhing beast. Ivara didn't think. She didn't calculate the odds. She simply moved. With a speed born of pure desperation, she threw herself into the center of the kill circle. She planted her feet between the advancing steel and the monster on the floor, spreading her arms wide to form a human shield. No, she shrieked, her voice cracking with fury. Stay back. The guards hesitated, their blades inches from her blue silk dress. Behind her, Kairos snarled, a sound of wet gravel, and lunged. A massive, clawed hand, half man, half wolf, swung wildly, ready to tear through whatever stood in its path. He didn't recognize her. He saw only an obstacle. Ivara spun around, ignoring the swords at her back, and caught the striking limb. She didn't block it, she stepped into it. She threw her arms around the heaving, monstrous bulk of his chest, pressing her heart against the jagged fur. Come back to me, she sobbed into the violence. The contact was like striking a match in a room full of gas. The faint golden markings on her skin didn't just glow, they detonated. A blinding pulse of pure, liquid sunlight exploded from her body. It wasn't a flicker, it was a supernova. The shockwave of light blasted outward, knocking the guards off their feet and sending swords clattering across the stone. Councilman Vayne shielded his eyes, crying out as the brilliance seared the shadows from the room. But for Kairos, the light wasn't a weapon. It was an antidote. The gold seeped into his black fur, sinking deep into his marrow. It hunted the wolfsbane in his veins and burned the poison to ash. The roar died in his throat, choking off into a confused whimper. The monstrous tension in his body dissolved. Under the blinding canopy of her power, the beast didn't just stop, it surrendered. The madness was washed away by the tide of her light, leaving only a stunned silence in its wake. The blinding brilliance receded, leaving the great hall washed in a stunned, hazy twilight. The silence was absolute, heavy with the dust of the shattered windows and the lingering ozone of a storm that had finally broken. In the center of the wreckage, the monstrous form of the wolf dissolved. It was not the violent, tearing transformation of the past, but a fluid return to humanity. Kairos emerged from the beast, his skin slick with sweat, his chest heaving. He was naked, stripped of his crown, his velvet, and his armor, yet he had never looked more powerful. The amber in his eyes was no longer a burning furnace. It was clear, deep, and steady, the eyes of a man who finally owned his own soul. Councilman Vane stood frozen, his sword dangling uselessly from his hand, waiting for the attack. But Kairos didn't even look at him. To the king, the traitor, the guards, and the terrified court ceased to exist. There was only the woman standing before him in a torn blue dress, her skin still humming with fading starlight. Slowly, with a reverence that stole the breath from every witness in the room, Kairos sank to his knees. He didn't kneel as a defeated warrior. He knelt as a devotee. He wrapped his powerful arms around Ivara's waist, burying his face against the silk covering her stomach. A shudder ran through him, not of pain, but of overwhelming, crushing relief. "It is silent," he whispered, his voice rough but steady, vibrating against her ribs. "The fire, it's gone. You quieted the sun, Ivara." Ivara rested her hands on his bare shoulders, her fingers threading through his damp, dark hair. She felt the steady, calm beat of his heart against her, a rhythm she had fought to save. She was no longer the tribute sent to die, she was the anchor that held the storm at bay. Kairos pulled back just enough to look up at her. "I sought a cure in blood and war," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. "But it was you. It was always you." He took her hand, pressing his lips to the golden markings on her wrist. "You are my breath, my sanity, my queen." The declaration hung in the air, absolute and unbreakable. Councilman Vane's sword clattered to the stones. He fell to his knees, head bowed low. Then the guards. Then the nobles. One by one, the entire court dropped to the floor, not in fear of the Alpha's teeth, but in awe of the Omega's light. Ivara looked out over the sea of bowed heads, then down at the king who knelt at her feet. She tightened her grip on him, no longer hiding the gold in her skin. She had tamed the monster, only to find the man, and in doing so, she had found herself.